Hey guys, it is Miss Param and Miss Cortez, and we are talking about evolution. So this is what all of our topics are going to revolve around for third quarter is evolution. So this is our introduction into it. So the theory of evolution. So to start with, a theory is a well-supported, testable explanation of phenomena that has occurred in the natural world. So when we say a theory, it's not exactly like for sure 100% fact, but there is no 100% fact in science. So, based off of observations that we can see around us, the data that we've collected, this is what we believe to be true. So, there is no 100% fact, so it is a theory. So, evolution, what is evolution? So, it is just basically stating that changes happen over time. So, this is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. Okay. So, the guy who came up with this theory of evolution, his name is Charles Darwin, and he wrote a book on the origin of the species. So, Charles Darwin was a British naturalist who wrote the book on the origin of the species, which was an instant bestseller. He originally only published like 1,200 copies, and then people couldn't get enough of it. And it is one of those like books that's like highly published out there, up with like the Bible and the Harry Potter books. Okay. So, he basically brought the concept of evolution to the masses with his book because he wrote it in a way that most people could understand it at the time. So, Darwin overall, he was a rich kid, but he didn't have much direction. He didn't do exceptionally well in school, and people didn't consider him to be exceptionally bright. But his parents did have an exceptional amount of money. So, when he was done with college, his family sent him on a voyage to collect some specimens from the New World, as they called it at the time, because the British were just exploring it, but it had existed already. And yeah, so let's not get into how, like, bad the New World is as a saying. Okay, so in his travels, he would observe many plants and animals and read the work of others. That would lead him to his theory. So he did a voyage on a ship called the HMS Beagle. So as a young man in the early 1800s, Darwin embarked on a trip around the world, going around the coast of South America, Africa, and Australia. So he took a big long trip. It took him about 5 years in total. He had a lot of time because it would take them months and months by sailboat to reach the shore of a country. He was very seasick most of the time and just did a lot of reading when they were on the ocean. So he collected animal specimens and different fossils to bring back to Britain. Darwin had three main observations aboard the Beagle: that species vary among around the world, species vary locally, and species vary over time. So, species vary around the world. So, his observation, he had many observations, but these were two that I pulled that I thought were interesting. So, Darwin saw rayas in South America, and these are large flightless birds pictured up top. And he also saw ostriches in Africa. Both of these are large flightless birds, but neither is found in the other's habitat, which he found really interesting. So, how do we have two animals that are very similar and they live in similar environments? But I don't find ostriches in South America, and I don't find rayas in Africa. Okay. His other observation is even though a land like Australia had really nice grasslands, like in England, they didn't have any rabbits. So that was another thing that was strange for him too, is how can environments be similar but also not have similar species at the same time? So the thing that he found overall is that places around the world had similar habitats, often had different animals that were ecologically similar. So even though the habitats are different, they had basically species that acted a lot the same. So while Australia didn't have rabbits, they did have kangaroos and wallabies that function a lot like rabbits in their consumption of grass. He also discovered that species vary locally. So, a great example of how species vary locally, Darwin found that in the Galapagos Islands. So, they are a chain of multiple islands off the coast of Ecuador in South America. So, The islands are small and close together, but a huge variety of wildlife lives there. So, one of the observations that he had was that each island had its own tortoise with its own unique shell. So, some of the people who lived on the Galapagos or some people from Ecuador showed him that each specific island had a different tortoise. He found this very, very interesting, that they weren't all the same tortoise, that they looked different from each other. A second observation is that someone showed him that there were a wide variety of finches that inhabited the island and that they lived in different parts of the same environment. So some of them lived uh, up in the cactuses, some of them fed from the ground, some of them ate different things. All of these birds were interrelated, but as he went from island to island, he saw a variety of beak sizes and color variation, even though they lived closely together. So he realized that related species often live in different habitats within a local area. He also came to the conclusion that species vary over time. So Darwin collected fossils, and fossils are just the remains or impressions of prehistoric organisms preserved in petrified form or as a mold or cast in rock. So these are usually not the actual organism left, but an impression where minerals have filled in and they've made where the organism was. So with finding fossils, some of the fossils he found looked nothing like living organisms. However, some fossils did. Darwin found fossils of a thing called a Glyptodon, which I don't think I'm saying correctly, that are very similar to modern day armadillos, but they are giant instead. So, some fossils of extinct animals were very similar to living species, which made Darwin believe that possibly these extinct organisms weren't just completely gone, but had changed over time into modern day organisms that look very similar to them. So, besides what he was seeing around him when Darwin was sailing from country to country during his seasick time, he did a lot of reading. So, he read works by a couple of geologists named Lyell and Hunt. So, in the 1800s, most people believed that the Earth was only 6,000 years old, that God put everything there, and that nothing had changed over time. However, there were other scientists out there before Darwin that questioned this and ended up influencing Darwin. So, Hutton was one of them. He was a geologist, and he suggested that geological processes shape the land, that mountains are built up by the movements of the earth, and that rain and water wears them down, erosion. Okay. So he came up with a thing called deep time to describe that Earth's history is so long that it's hard to imagine how long it is. Because when we think about geological time, we're not talking about hundreds of years or thousands of years. We are talking about millions of years, which is really hard to conceptualize because humans have not been around for millions of years. Okay. Lyell is another geologist who affected Darwin, and he said that the laws of nature do not change. So, this is stating that volcanoes have always operated in the same way for millions of years, that rivers have always run the same way. Just the basic properties of the earth have always worked the same and have not changed. So Hutton and Lyell concluded that the earth is extremely old and also that the processes that changed the earth in the past are the same processes that operate in the present. So earthquakes have always worked the same way. It's tornadoes, hurricanes, etc., etc. He also read this guy named Lamarck, who came up with some evolutionary theories that were like quite trendy in France before Darwin put out his theory. And Lamarck got really close, but not quite. So basically, Lamarck thought that organisms could will themselves to become better or evolve, that organisms wanted to come better to best fit the environment that they're living in, that these changes could be made during an organism's lifetime. A giraffe's neck becomes longer as it reaches for the leaves. So this wouldn't be happening from generation to generation. This would all be happening in the giraffe's lifetime. So he believed that as the giraffe stretched, that it would grow more and more vertebrae bones in its neck until it eventually had a very long neck. And as we know from our discussions about mutations, we cannot will ourselves to change or to mutate. Okay? He then thought with these organisms, basically, after the giraffe had a long neck, when it had babies, its babies would just have a long neck for sure. Um, he was very, very wrong that organisms could will themselves to change or mutate. So this does not happen. This is not evolution. Some people still can use this. This is still a common misconception, even though this is hundreds of years old now and people still believe that evolution happens like this. This is not how it happens. Okay. So the part that Lamarck was right on is that we inherit traits from our parents. He got that very correct. However, he did not get correct that organisms can will themselves to mutate or change. And we will talk about that more as we get into natural selection. Okay. Darwin also read the works of this guy named Thomas Malthus, who talked about population growth. So Thomas Malthus was an economist that noticed that more people are being born than dying, and that leads to overpopulation. And overpopulation leads to deplorable conditions, and that these deplorable conditions would lead people to die of war, disease, and starvation, which would slow the population growth. Because if you are at war, or there's a huge disease going around, or people are starving to death, obviously people aren't having an abundance of children. Okay. So Darwin saw that Malthus's ideas were true for other organisms as well. And this led him to wonder why certain individuals survived and why others did not. Darwin also observed that if populations grow uncontrolled, then there would not be enough food and space for everyone to live. Another thing is that once Darwin got back from his travels, he didn't write about his ideas right away. He sat on them for a very long time. So he started doing this thing. He married like rich, he had a lot of money, he just kind of played around. So he started doing this thing called pigeon fancying, where it's a sport where you breed pigeons for specific traits. So, breeding his pigeons, Darwin saw that there was a wide variety of traits out there. However, by breeding certain characteristics, he saw that they may be passed down to the next generation. This is artificial selection, so where a human is selecting the traits they want to see in their crops or livestock. So nature was providing this wide variety of traits, but Darwin himself was selecting which ones would be passed down. So Darwin figured that in nature, nature was selecting for the traits as well as providing a large variety of traits to be picked from. With this final thought, Darwin was ready to write his book. Also, too, Darwin had already published a paper kind of talking about evolution with this guy named Russell Wallace. Wallace was like the poor version of Darwin, where he struggled quite a lot and came to the same discoveries and conclusions. However, Wallace came to the conclusion of natural selection as well and was going to publish a book about it. But instead, Darwin beat him to the punch, wrote a 500-page bestseller about natural selection, and put that out there, and Wallace didn't get any credit. But what Darwin's theory of evolution was, so these are like the spark notes of like what those 500 pages were about. So, from all of these influences that we discussed, Darwin came to the theory of evolution, explaining how modern organisms evolved over millions of years from a shared ancestor. These are the three main tenets of his ideas. The first one is descent with modification, and this is that all organisms come from their parents and inherit similar traits. However, they may be slightly different from the previous generation. And this gets back to what we were talking about previously with sexual reproduction and genetic recombination, where you come from your parents, you're like your parents, but you're maybe better. Okay. And their offspring may be slightly different than them. So, this is simply stating that species change over time from generation to generation. Okay. So, this is not a quick evolution like Lamarck was talking about. It takes time for evolution to happen. The next one is common descent. This is that all organisms come from a previous generation that was able to survive and reproduce. So, in logic, if you go back far enough, all species today come from a singular ancestor. And we will talk more about that. Okay. On top of that, there is natural selection. So, this is organisms with traits that best fit their environment survive and have more offspring than others. Okay. So, organisms with traits that best fit their environment survive and have more offspring than others. So, if you look over here, this is like a drawing from Darwin's notebook, and this is him talking about common descent. So, here he has the first organism where we can see that he was thinking that, okay, different organisms branched off from that, which inspired different types of organisms and more different types of organisms. So some things are more closely interrelated than others, but we all came from a common universal ancestor. So we're going to talk about that. That organism is called LUCA, last universal common ancestor. We'll talk about that later. But let's talk a little more about natural selection. So in Darwin's book, he really drives home the point of evolution by natural selection. So, this is how Darwin believed that natural selection shaped species. So, the first step is the struggle for existence. So, we must compete for resources to be able to survive. So, an example of this would be grasshoppers. They can lay hundreds of eggs, but only a few of those eggs will survive. From there, there's variation and adaptation. So, this is stating that some inheritable traits will make surviving an environment easier than others. These traits are called adaptations. So, some grasshoppers are green and some are brown. These are this variation of traits. However, if you're living in an environment that is green, it's going to better suit you. It'll be an adaptation than being brown. Okay. So, 3, with the survival of the fittest, organisms that have traits that best help them survive and reproduce are more fit than others. So the grasshoppers blend in with the grass while the brown ones get eaten by the birds. So we have more of our green grasshoppers surviving than our brown grasshoppers. And then finally, our last one, natural selection, that organisms with traits that best fit their environment survive and leave more offspring. Since there are more green grasshoppers left in the next generation, there will be more green grasshoppers than brown. So here's a little illustration to drive that point home. But that is what I have for you guys today. I hope you have an awesome day. Bye.